Good afternoon. Love's Labour's Lost has been called an enigma of dramatic history, and rightly so. It is a very complex and multi-layered play. My interpretation is that it closely mirrors actual comic and tragic events in Anglo-Russian relations, and that Shakespeare captured and immortalized in it much of a largely forgotten Tudor history. To truly appreciate the play, we need to rediscover the captivating story of English-Russian relations in the second half of the 16th century, which I attempt to do in my book, Shakespeare, Elizabeth, and Ivan. Most scholars have accepted a traditional interpretation that it is Shakespeare's French play because it is set in France and has 5 male characters whose names are associated with the French Wars of Religion. And indeed, France plays a very important part in this story. But then we have the Mask of the Russians in Act 5. Here, for the first time in Shakespeare, we come across Russians, well, mock Russians. If we take the play at face value, it is a frivolous comedy of manners in which the appearance of these comical masquerading Russians can easily be dismissed as a kind of historical curiosity, demonstrating English contempt for the primitive Russians. However, a more accurate description is that Love's Labour's Lost is a sophisticated Elizabethan romp deeply concerned with current foreign affairs, international trade, and royal courtship. Shakespeare's lifetime coincided with a very exciting time. The 16th century was a great age of discovery, of distant voyages, of enterprise, and of commerce. Exploration was driven by the dire state of the English economy, which was a result of several factors, such as Henry VIII's gross fiscal mismanagement, the expense of keeping England independent of Spain, and the loss of Calais, which dealt a devastating blow to the cloth industry, woolen cloth being the main item of English export. When the Elizabethan age began, England desperately needed new markets. The main promoters of exploration and discovery were English merchants. They knew that England was lagging behind Spain and Portugal in exploration and wanted to join the race in order to get to the fabulous riches and spices from the East. The English, therefore, desperately wanted to find a sea route to the Far East so that they could buy directly from China, India, and the so-called Spice Islands. The 1550s broke the prior isolation of 2 countries, England and Russia, both situated on the periphery of Europe. Their aligned history began in 1553. That year, 3 ships set out from England in search of the northeast passage to China. Although only 1 ship survived, it accidentally ended up on the shores of the White Sea in the Russian north, beginning the fateful encounter with Muscovy, as Russia was then called. Richard Chancellor, the leader of the expedition, managed to reach Moscow, where he was wined and dined by the country's ruler, Ivan IV, Grozny, known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan immediately saw the advantages of trade with England and proceeded to grant the English unprecedented trading privileges. The Tsar was surrounded by enemies and constantly at war with his neighbors. He was badly in need of ships, weapons, and various specialists. England could readily provide all that. England, in turn, would benefit from Russia's raw materials, such as leather, wax, tallow, flax, and hemp. And it would find a lucrative market for its woolen cloths. What followed was a 90-year-long Anglo-Russian exchange, which was comical and tragical at the same time. And Shakespeare capitalized on that. The initial contact led to the formation of the Muscovy Company 2 years later. This was the first limited liability company, and hence the foundation stone of modern capitalism. Many other trading companies would model themselves on it in the future. The Muscovy Company was a remarkable institution for its time. This is where the English court and commerce overlapped. Over 10% of the founding members of the company were high-ranking courtiers and the country's elite. Among the original members were the grandfathers of Philip Sidney, the third Earl of Southampton, and the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, to whom Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated. Last, but by far not least, was William Cecil, future Lord Burleigh, who 40 years later, in 1595, was said to be, I quote, the oldest original member of the company still living, end of quote. After Queen Mary's death, once the company's membership was expanded, Burleigh was joined by other Elizabeth's right-hand men, such as the Earl of Leicester, Francis Walsingham, and Christopher Hatton. All these Queen's men were actively involved in trade with Russia and had personal financial stakes in the success or failure of the company's expeditions. Elizabeth herself was personally involved and would lend her own ships to the company. At that time, there was no distinction between the Queen's personal assets and that of the country's treasury. Prosperous voyages meant that she was personally enriched. Because of navigation issues and bad weather conditions, both the English envoys in Russia and the Russian envoys in England stayed in their respective countries for almost a year. This gave both courts and their rulers a chance to get to know each other more closely. So the Queen and her court were familiar with the Russian envoys, their behavior, their customs, their expectations, as well as their elaborate outfits, which seemed strange and rather similar to clothes worn in Turkey, the country that was considered by the English to be both exotic and barbaric. Trade at the time was the motivating force behind political alliances and was often accompanied by marriage proposals. Elizabeth welcomed to her court 5 Russian envoys, 4 during Ivan's reign and 1 during the reign of Boris Godunov. All these visits involved marriage negotiations between the two countries. The following is an overview of this exchange. First, we have Ivan thinking of marrying Elizabeth. His advances to her began in 1567 and were carried to her court orally by her first English ambassador to Russia, Anthony Jenkinson. Elizabeth avoided the matrimonial proposal for several years by pretending it must have been a mistake and that Jenkinson, who did not speak Russian, had muddled the Tsar's words. The blame was also put on the translator, who supposedly mistranslated things for Jenkinson. I believe this episode is reflected in the masquerade of the Russians in Act 5 of Love's Laws. In the following passage, Boyer serves as a go-between in the dysfunctional exchange between the men pretending to be Russian envoys and the princes pretending not to understand them. Rosaline is pretending to be the princess. What would the strangers know their mind, boyar? If they do speak our language, 'tis our will that some plain men recount their purposes. Know what they would? Boyar to the Russians. What would you with the princess? Biron, dressed as a Russian. Nothing but peace and gentle visitation. Rosaline. What would they, say they? Boyar. Nothing but peace and gentle visitation. Rosaline. Why, that they have, and bid them to be gone. Boyar. She says you have it, and you may be gone. King, dressed as Russian. Say to her, we have measured many miles to tread a measure with her on this grass. Boyar. They say they have measured many a mile to tread a measure with you on this grass. Rosaline. It is not so. Ask them how many inches is in 1 mile. If they have measured many, the measure then of one is easily told. Boyar. If to come hither, you have measured miles and many miles. The princess bids you tell how many inches does fill up 1 mile. Biron. Tell her we measure them by weary steps. Boyar. She hears herself. So Boyar can't stand the charade any longer, and he resigns his unnecessary appointment as an interpreter. Ivan gave Elizabeth 1 year to respond to his proposal and demanded for the answer to be brought back by his favorite Jenkinson. Instead, Elizabeth chose a seasoned diplomat, Thomas Randolph, who was sent in 1568 and handled a delicate matter of Elizabeth's failure to respond to Ivan's marriage proposal. The second round of Russian-English marriage negotiations, those of 1582-1583, were also immortalized in Love's Labour's Lost. By then, Ivan had been waiting for over 15 fruitless years for Elizabeth to respond to his marriage proposal. Our wooing does not end like an old play. Jack has not Jill, complains Biron at the end of Love's Labour's Lost. Ivan certainly did not have Elizabeth. Elizabeth's idea was not to agree to marry the Tsar, but to keep him hoping so as to keep the trade going. In the early 1580s, Ivan found himself in difficult political and personal circumstances. In 1581, he lost the Baltic port of Narva to the Swedes, and he knew that the recently concluded peace with Poland would only be temporary. Moreover, in November 1581, he inadvertently killed his oldest son and heir in a fit of rage. That left his sickly second son, Fyodor, as the heir apparent. In this tense climate of fear and paranoia, England beckoned to Ivan more than ever as a safe haven from his personal and political turmoil. Wanting to unite himself with the English royal house, he reached out to Elizabeth again, inquiring if she had an unmarried relative he could propose to. Elizabeth didn't waste any time. Through her doctor, whom she sent to attend Ivan, she suggested a different candidate, Lady Mary Hastings, sister of Henry Hastings, the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon. In her childhood, Mary was engaged to Edward de Vere, the future 17th Earl of Oxford. But all the arrangements fell apart when, at the age of 12, the boy became the ward of state, destined to marry Aunt Cecil, daughter of William Cecil. Lady Mary was Elizabeth's very distant relative, but she was presented to Ivan as Elizabeth's niece. Elizabeth's plan worked. Ivan was smitten with the idea of Lady Mary as his next wife. That would make wife number 8. and the new and very secret marriage negotiations opened in May of 1582. As his ambassador, Ivan chose Fyodor Pisimsky, one of the most experienced and ablest Russian diplomats. Pisimsky was dispatched in the summer of 1582 and reached England that September. He was to renew Ivan's request for a political alliance and to request more weapons and military supplies. Pisimsky was also to be a facilitator of the Tsar's romantic endeavors. He was to meet and closely observe Lady Mary and to return with her portrait. Pisimsky reached England on September 27, 1582. Christopher Carlyle, Lord Admiral of the English Navy, rushed to report the safe arrival of the Russians to the Queen. Elizabeth thus received warning of the imminent arrival of the Russian envoys, just as the princess does in Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost, prior to the Masque of the Muscovites. I believe this is represented in the following scene in Love's Labour's Lost. Boyer runs in, huffing and puffing. "Prepare, madam, prepare! Arm, wenches, arm! Encounters mounted are against your peace. Love does approach disguised. Arm it in argument, you'll be surprised. Muster your wits, stand in your own defense, or hide your heads like cowards and fly hence." Notice the references to arms and military supplies. That's what Elizabeth was supplying Ivan with as part of her trade bargain. We learn from Pisimsky's report to Ivan, which is only available in Russian, that he was not admitted to the Queen for several months. He was told that because she had dismissed the majority of her household as a result of the plague, Elizabeth was now unable to entertain foreign visitors. In other words, she, just like the king in Love's Labour's Lost, swore out housekeeping. Pisimsky craved to see the Queen. However, instead of being granted an audience, he was flattered daily with visits from high-ranking court officials and leading merchants of the Muscovy Company. On November 25th, the ambassador was visited by the governor of the Muscovy Company with its 17 members. They had come to invite him to join a royal hunting party. The Russians didn't want to go, as they were abstaining from meat that day, and so killing the animals would serve no purpose. The English persisted, saying the Queen would be offended if they didn't go. It is well known that hunting was one of Elizabeth's favorite sports. In Act 4 of Love's Labour's Lost, there is a hunting scene in which the princess, who several scholars believe represents Elizabeth, is instructed by her forester where to stand in order to make the fairest shoot. Perhaps Elizabeth wanted to display her well-known skills as a huntress to make a strong impression on the Russians. The princess laments having to injure the animal more for praise than for purpose. When Pisimsky was finally invited to Windsor, the attendance at this audience with the Queen was more than impressive. The entire Muscovy Company and the whole court were in attendance, and most of the nobles and peers who were present were either past or current members of the Muscovy Company. Besides the court members, indoors, over 400 people waited outside, sumptuously dressed in scarlet uniforms. Ivan always insisted on great pomp when receiving foreign visitors or when sending his own envoys abroad. He accused Elizabeth of receiving his previous envoy, I quote, "in her onion garden," end of quote. So now, in no sense could Pisimsky accuse Elizabeth of inadequate respect towards his royal master. It may be a spoiler for those who haven't read my book yet, but I'm the first person, to my knowledge, to suggest that Don Adriano de Armado was modeled on Ivan, and that his sons, Ivan Jr., Fyodor, and Dmitri, find their representation in Kostad, Nathaniel, and Moss. Holofernes, I believe, is modeled on Boris Godunov. During Pisimsky's second audience with the Queen in January 1583, the same pomp and processions were maintained as before, with the participation of virtually the entire court. The purpose of this particular meeting was finally to discuss the delicate issue of marriage between Ivan and Lady Mary. Elizabeth met one-on-one with Pisimsky in her chamber. Even his secretary was not allowed into the room and had to wait outside. During the meeting, according to Pisimsky's secret report to Ivan, Elizabeth said she loved her brother, Ivan, and would be very happy to be related to him by such family ties. She did, however, express some objections. They were not to do with Ivan's desire to marry again, but rather with his choice of bride. Elizabeth said she knew that Ivan was a great appreciator of female beauty. Unfortunately, said Elizabeth, Lady Mary simply was not beautiful enough for him. The Queen wanted someone more lovely for her beloved brother than just a mediocre beauty as Lady Mary. This was further dissembling on Elizabeth's part, as she knew quite well that Mary was considered to be very pretty. Pisimsky was not deterred by these objections and continued to insist on meeting Lady Mary. Elizabeth explained that Lady Mary was recovering from smallpox and until her face was fully healed, would not be available neither for the interview with Pisimsky nor to have her portrait painted. Whether this was true or just a ruse to keep Pisimsky at bay, we do not know. But Love's Labour's Lost provides a fascinating clue. Rosaline says to another lady in waiting, "Oh, that your face were not so full of O's," referring to smallpox scars. The princess cuts in with the words, "A pox of that jest." If the pretense that Lady Mary had smallpox had been a joke on Pisimsky, the court would have fully appreciated it. A number of references to painting and the lack of it in Love's Labour's Lost suggest that the remark about the pox was in fact a jest. Elizabeth successfully prevented Pisimsky from seeing Lady Mary for 7 months. An audience finally did take place on May 18th, 1583, in the garden of York House. During the audience, a special tent-like canopy was constructed, one that was not unlike the tent that King provided for the princess and her ladies in Love's Labour's Lost. Pisimsky was to sit in it together with Lady Mary's brother, the 3rd Earl of Huntingdon, and Thomas Randolph, the former envoy to Russia. Lady Mary then arrived, surrounded by young ladies and gentlemen of the court. The meeting occurred during the day, so that Pisimsky might have an excellent look at Mary's features and complexion, all in good light. It was constantly stressed to Pisimsky that Mary was introduced to him in daylight, thus enabling him to see her true countenance. In other words, nothing was hidden from Pisimsky that might otherwise have been obscured by candlelight. The Queen and Thomas Randolph continually insisted that Pisimsky confirm he had indeed been able to observe Lady Mary carefully and convey it to the Tsar upon his return to Russia. In Love's Labour's Lost, Longueville questions Boyer about Maria's identity. "I beseech you, a word. Who is she in the white?" a woman sometimes, as you saw her in the light. I believe this is another reference to Ivan's courtship of Lady Mary, hinting at Pisemsky's being reassured by Elizabeth that he was allowed to see Mary not in some dark room, but in the light, as per Ivan's request. There are many other references to light and seeing in the play. In contemporary English accounts, there exists only one reference to this meeting. It is found in the memoirs of the English envoy to Russia, Sir Jerome Horsey, entitled The Travels of Sir Jerome Horsey, Knight, written sometime between 1590 and Horsey's death in 1623. As we look at the passage from the Travels, I would like you to keep in mind that this memoir, until the 19th century, was available only in a manuscript form. It was edited and published for the first time in 1856 by Edward Bond, a librarian at the British Library. Horsey's memoir includes a fascinating picture of the meeting between Pisemsky and Lady Mary, which enables us to see it from the English perspective. Her Majesty caused that lady to be attended on with diverse great ladies and maids of honor and young noblemen, the number of which appointed, to be seen by the said ambassador in York House garden. She put on a stately countenance accordingly. The ambassador, attended with diverse other noblemen and others, was brought before her ladyship, cast down his countenance, fell prostrate to her feet, rise, ran back from her, his face still towards her, she and the rest admiring at his manner. Said by an interpreter, it did suffice him to behold the angel he hoped should be his master's spouse, commended her angelical countenance, state, and admirable beauty. She afterwards called by her familiar friends at court the Empress of Muscovy. Note that Longueville in Love's Lost, the same person who was told that he saw Maria in the light, wrote a love sonnet to her that begins with these words: "O sweet Maria, Empress of my love," where Empress of my love is a parody on Empress of Muscovy. But let's examine Horsey's description of the meeting more closely. Its relevance to the Russian masque in Love, Labour's Lost cannot be overestimated. There are at least 3 quotations in the play that closely mirror the meeting in York House as described by Horsey. Shakespeare seems to be familiar with Horsey's account, and Horsey's account mirrors that of Pisemsky's report to Ivan very carefully. The first of these quotations is the opening of Act 5, in which we meet Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel, who are returning from some kind of feast. Holofernes says, "Satis quod sufficit," which is that which suffices is enough in Latin, which implies the proverbial enough is as good as a feast. This quote is baffling to both scholars and audiences, as there is no indication as to what it refers. It is, however, almost exactly what Pisemsky said while observing Lady Mary. Said by an interpreter, it did suffice him to behold the angel he hoped should be his master's spouse. In the next scene, we find the men getting ready to play Russians before the ladies. Unbeknown to them, Boyer overhears them and reports to the women that the men are practicing how to speak and to walk like Russians, and are teaching Moss, the herald, what to do and say. The king warns Moss. "For," quoth the king, "an angel shalt thou see." Yet fear not thou, but speak audaciously. This quote seems to echo Pisimsky's comparison of Mary with an angel. The next two lines from the play are very interesting. The boy replied, "An angel is not evil. I should have feared her had she been a devil." So why should Moss be frightened? Well, Hawes's account helps answer that question too. The ambassador was brought before her ladyship, cast down his countenance, fell prostrate to her feet, rise, ran back from her, his face still towards her, she and the rest admiring at his manner. Englishmen who had been to Russia or seen a Russian envoy at court had seen the show of obsequious behavior before. Exactly as performed in Russia, Pisimsky fell down and banged his forehead on the ground before Lady Mary. This Russian custom, performed by a sovereign's loyal subjects to indicate their subjection and obedience, was referred to in many envoy accounts, both English and foreign. In Love's Labour's Lost, this custom is also treated comically. Boyer reports to the princes that while practicing how to act as Russians, the men also practice falling down. I quote, "With this they all did tumble on the ground," end of quote, just as Pisimsky fell down at Lady Mary's feet. Pisimsky's behavior only reinforced the English view that the Russian religion was not as holy as the English faith. Hawes's observation that the courtiers present were admiring at his manner was diplomacy at its best. Love's Labour's Lost is more direct. The women heap abuses on the men dressed as Russians, deriding outright their shallow shows, badly written speeches, and ridiculous behavior. They call them fat, gross, and slow-witted. Rosaline suggests to the princes that even after the men removed their Russian habits, the lady should continue to mock them. "Good madam, if by me you'll be advised, let's mock them still, as well known as disguised. Let us complain to them. What fools were here, disguised like Muscovites in shapeless gear, and wonder what they were, and to what end their shallow show and prologue vilely penned, and their rough carriage so ridiculous, should be presented at our tent to us." Ivan's ardor for marriage with English royalty was only matched by the Muscovy Company's pursuits of trading privileges and defense of their extremely favored position in Russia. While Pisimsky was in town, Elizabeth kept complaining to him of the continual infringement of the northern trade route by foreign traders. When it came to the protection of her own interests, Elizabeth did not hesitate to make demands on behalf of the Muscovy Company. Her agenda with Pisimsky consisted of 3 items. Firstly, the right to import and export goods duty-free. These were privileges promised, but often revoked by Ivan at whim. Secondly, she wanted the return of the company's use of the Russian mainland for trade with Persia. And thirdly, and most importantly, she wanted the reinstatement of the monopoly of the Muscovy Company's trade with Russia. Elizabeth truly believed that the northern route through the White Sea was England's right as the discoverers of Russia in 1553. And yet, in the mid-1570s, the company began facing fierce competition, first from the Dutch and then from the French, while Elizabeth was pouring money into Netherlands against the Spanish and helping Henry of Navarre with manpower and finances for him to prevail over the Catholic League headed by the Guise faction. These two countries were intruding on English turf and pulling the rug under the English merchants in Russia. I believe the competition with the Dutch and the French is touched upon in Love's Labour's Lost. For her part, Elizabeth did not want to concede anything to the Russians. She did not agree to marry the Tsar, nor did she grant the same tax privileges to Ivan's representatives in London that she was demanding for her own merchants in Muscovy. Elizabeth was just like the princess in Love's Labour's Lost, who wanted to secure the trade for herself, but to concede nothing to others. In Love's Labour's Lost, the princess says, "There is no such sport as sport by sport overthrown, to make theirs ours, and ours none but our own." As far as the English were concerned, Ivan was an oath-breaker. He refused to acknowledge England's right to the trade that they had sacrificed so much to establish and maintain. He reneged on the pledge he had made on numerous occasions to keep England as Russia's preferred trading partner and to keep all foreign traders out of Russia. He reneged on his permission to search for China through the Russian territories in order to trade with Persia. These were the documents that Thomas Randolph carried back with him to England in 1569. It is not surprising, therefore, that one of the main themes of Love's Labour's Lost is the breaking of oaths. Love's Labour's Lost contains more words and expressions to do with oath-making and oath-breaking than any other Shakespeare's play. In fact, there are over 70 of them. Elizabeth clearly had no intention to sending away the petrified Lady Mary, yet the show had to go on if trade with Russia was to continue. By now, the English Navy was dependent on Russian-made rope and sails. By the end of the 1580s, a quarter of the English Navy's budget went on Russian rope alone, contributing in no small way to the victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. The only remedy of restoring England's loss of the monopoly of trade with Russia was to keep the idea of Anglo-Russian marriage alive for yet another year. Since the arrangements of the marriage to Lady Mary Hastings were left up in the air, Elizabeth needed to place another carrot in front of Ivan's nose in the form of a new royal bride. Another envoy was sent to Russia. His name was Jerome Bowes. Bowes tantalized Ivan with claims that Elizabeth had 10 more unmarried relatives who fitted the bill perfectly. Ivan announced in a letter he expedited to Elizabeth that he will be leaving for England in spring with the next sailing of English ships. Elizabeth and her court must have been on the edge of their seats. Nothing could be done to stop him, since Elizabeth granted Ivan asylum in England, the document which was delivered to her in 1569 by Thomas Randolph, whose name you heard mentioned so many times today. Randolph, who spent a whole year in Russia, knew very well all about Ivan's sable-colored melancholy and what it could do. Well, Ivan never made it to England. This larger-than-life personality passed away in March 1583, before the English ships sailed back to England. But Elizabeth came that close to having her own Don Adriano de Armado on her doorstep. In conclusion, I believe that Love's Labour's Lost was an in-house satire written for Queen Elizabeth and her court. It is a spoof on Ivan's possible arrival at the English court. The topical jokes and allusions refer to the real-life historical episodes and diplomatic hiccups within the Russian-English relations. The personalities from the Russian and English courts and the names of England's competitors embedded in the text of Love's Labour's Lost would have been understood by the Queen and those close to the seat of power. Unfortunately, until now, without the knowledge of those hidden references and historical allusions within Love's Labour's Lost, it was difficult to appreciate Shakespeare's understanding of Elizabethan foreign policy, as well as his contribution to our understanding of that period in which he lived. I very much hope that my book will help to remedy this. Thank you for your attention.